And we're probably not going to be cheering so much for some of them, because you'll never take back our country with weakness. You have to show strength, and you have to be strong.
But I'd be on that phone call every single day. I'd be up that guy's yin-yang so far with a firecracker he wouldn't know what hit him from Pfizer. I'd be outside that guy's house. Every time he moved, I'd be saying, where's our vaccines?
Change has come to Georgia. Yeah. Change is coming to America.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to the LeanTossup podcast. This week, we are joined by Chris Curtis from Opinion Research in the UK. Chris, how are you doing today?
I'm doing all right, thanks. How are you doing?
Pretty good. And Chris, you're coming to us from where?
London, South London. Still under lockdown rules, but looking forward to the upcoming freedoms that we're hopefully getting.
Yes, that's true. Yes, you guys are doing very well vaccinations. You should hopefully be able to have a lot of those restrictions lifted pretty soon. That being said, though, I'm coming to you from Ontario, and I'm also joined by someone else in Ontario, someone a little closer to Toronto, Kyle. He's coming to us from a car parked somewhere in Burlington. Kyle, how are you today?
I'm pretty good. I'm just parked outside of Montana, so.
That's good. Well, thank you for joining us. We'll like your insight, even though you're in a car. And also joining us today is Nikos, coming to us from Manitoba. How are you doing today?
Good, thank you. Great to be back.
Thank you. So, I'm actually really happy we got someone from the UK here, because I've been dying to do a section on UK politics. Again, it was kind of we did a lot more with the UK closer to the 2019 election. But since we've not much has happened in terms of, say, polling, basically what we saw a resurgence of Labour kind of mid last year. They were kind of tied, maybe taking lean a couple surveys, but when you average it out, basically tied. To now, we're definitely seeing some substantial movement in the polling. Chris, sorry. What are you seeing in the polling from your firm?
So, I mean, our latest poll, which was out on Saturday, basically showed a fairly similar thing to that. So we have seen a not comfortable, but a small lead for the Conservatives re-emerging since those neck-and-neck results we were seeing late last year and into the new year. So our most recent results was a 6-point lead for the Conservatives. But I think probably more importantly, we've sort of seen a real bounce back in Boris Johnson's personal polling. So his net approval rating has gone up from being negative for 6-7 months to now into positive territory. So we had a net score of +7% more people approved of the job he was doing than disapproved. That's his best polling figure since early May last year, and also importantly, for the first time since May last year as well, it means that his approval ratings look better than the leader of the opposition, Keir Starmer's approval ratings.
And why do you think that is, right? Because a lot of people right now, we're talking about, I know we see a lot of people in our Twitter mentions talking about why we're seeing what we're seeing in the polling, right? Why do you think Boris Johnson's approval ratings are up? Is there anything specifically he's done, or do you think it's just kind of because the UK is succeeding right now in the vaccine?
So it is the fact that, I mean, lots of people call it a vaccine bounce, and it has undoubtedly at least somewhat to do with the fact that the vaccine rollout is going incredibly successfully. In our most recent poll, I can't remember the exact numbers, but something like 7 in 10 people, including a majority of Labour voters, think that Boris Johnson's doing a good job, or the government's doing a good job at the vaccine rollout, and just 9% off the top of my head think it's going badly. So a tiny fraction think that that's going badly, which is an incredibly good number. So that's undoubtedly part of the story. I also think Johnson's generally just got better at the job. His messaging, his comms work, he's got a new team in around him, and they're just doing a much better job at communicating that message that they were really, really struggling with for a lot of last year. And then I think the third element of this is kind of linked to the previous two, but the conversation is no longer about them underreacting to coronavirus. So for a lot of the autumn last year and really into the Christmas, there was a general narrative that the government weren't doing enough to stop the spread of coronavirus. They were making decisions too late. They were putting new lockdown rules into place too late when that virus was spreading, and that was hurting their polling numbers. Now, basically, if anything, the public thinks that the government's probably being a little bit too strict given how well the vaccine rollout is going, and the government is communicating in a way that is really pushing forward on this. No, we're going to be tough. We're going to go slowly coming out of lockdown message. So they've sort of mitigated against that big weakness they had a few months ago.
Yeah, and I think probably one of the craziest things we've seen is we see that when you look at kind of early stages of the pandemic, the countries that were kind of criticized for doing kind of the least in terms of your big kind of Western bloc countries, you look at the U.S. and the U.K. Obviously, early on in the pandemic, Boris Johnson and Donald Trump were very heavily criticized for their responses. They thought they were very underwhelming. UK obviously enforced national lockdowns. They have kind of the authority to do that. In the U.S., that's a lot harder to do, say, a national lockdown. But Donald Trump fought a lot harder against the lockdown, though. But it's interesting now that we're basically we're exactly at the 1 year mark of the pandemic, and now that's kind of flipped around. The countries that early on were seen as doing the worst, kind of the U.S. and the U.K., they're now doing the best because now they're the more industrialized companies that can produce the vaccine domestically, and they're getting those vaccines into people's arms. Whereas other countries like Canada, where early on we actually were doing a really good job at stopping the spread and had very few relative cases, now we're starting to see approval ratings in those countries lag as we're struggling to get vaccines because we cannot produce it domestically. We have to outsource it to other countries. And those other countries are hoarding theirs. We're getting less shots, right? So that's kind of a really interesting thing. And I mean, obviously in the U.S. there was a change of the guard, right, in November, right? So Donald Trump can no longer get credit for that. It goes to Joe Biden. But in the U.K., nothing's happened to Boris, right? He's still the prime minister, right? So he's getting all the credit for that. I think so. Then, in that case, and also another key point to that too is that they actually finished the Brexit deal, right? They actually that was kind of something that had been hanging over this government's head for a while, and recently, a couple months ago, they were able to kind of finalize it, and they've now been able to move on and are able to kind of go forward with their post Brexit planning. So that also is probably helping there a little too, and probably helping with some Leave voters. I think the big question, though, and we see this a lot online, and we see this in our mentions, and I'm sure, Chris, you see it in your mentions as well. A lot of Labour voters appear, or kind of online Labour left appear, very upset with Keir Starmer in their current polling position. Do you think this is Keir Starmer's fault? Because we see a lot of articles of like what Keir Starmer should be doing. Should he have better messaging? What do you kind of think? Is Keir Starmer messing this up, or is he just kind of going along with the current here?
Yeah, I mean, he's doing what is basically one of the hardest jobs in politics, and we as a country don't really know what we want from a leader of the opposition. Do we want them to hold the government to account? Do we want them to be too critical? Do we want them to hold back and be supportive? And it's an impossible balancing act, I think, for any leader of the opposition. And Keir Starmer's probably trying to walk that tightrope and finding it just as difficult as pretty much anyone else would be in that position. So you will see in the polling lots and lots of people. We've got a question in field at the moment that I was just flicking through before I came to speak to you, where I was just asking people who had changed their minds on Keir Starmer, why have they changed their minds? And you have half the people saying, well, he's not sticking up and attacking the government enough. And you have the other half of the people going, well, he's just being too critical and bitchy and moany towards the government. So it's not an easy task for him. And that's always going to be the case. And you will almost always see a drop in leaders polling for leaders of the opposition at this stage. David Cameron, who later went on to be prime minister, he saw a drop off that was roughly equal to what we've seen for Keir Starmer. What we do know in the numbers, however, is that Starmer's numbers, the fall in Starmer's approval rating has been a lot more dramatic amongst those who voted Labour at the last election compared to those who voted Conservative. If you look at Keir Starmer's approval rating amongst people who voted Conservative at the 2019 election, it's really not that bad. Somewhere around 1 in 5 of them approve of Keir Starmer's job performance. If half of those people end up moving over to the Labour Party, that would put him in a really good stead to be the country's next prime minister. The problem really is this dramatic drop-off in support for him among Labour Party's base. And I think it's just that difficulty when you're at this point in the Parliament and you're really trying to work out what to oppose, what to support, and how to not come across as unprincipled and wishy-washy, which I think at this stage he quite often is.
Yeah, that's a lot of really good points, right? And I mean, again, especially when the government is doing something that's this successful that a lot of people like, right? I mean, it's very, very rare in kind of the history of Western democracy that a government is doing something this popular, right? I mean, again, usually there's some sort of reform, and obviously you have people against or pro reforms, but when we're looking at vaccinating people against a deadly virus, that's getting universal approval, right? And it's really hard to kind of oppose a government doing that, right? I mean, obviously people are for that, but it's very hard to kind of carve out a niche of being opposed to it. Again, the UK isn't having an election for several years now. I think it's going to be 2024 at the minimum. I think 2023, 2024, somewhere around there, depending on how your election law works. I'm not exactly sure because it was a weird kind of date that happened on, but again, still several years away, and I'm sure there'll be many opportunities for Keir Starmer to criticize Boris Johnson at some point in the future once when they're not vaccinating people every day. One kind of interesting piece on that, and we'll kind of get to it a bit later, but are you seeing a kind of divergence? And you mentioned it with conservative voters in the with conservative voters from 2019. Are you seeing a split for Keir Starmer on like Leave Remain or educational demographics? Because that plays into it a little bit too. Because in 2018, conservatives did still pick up quite a lot of Remain voters. Are those Remain voters that are favorable of Keir Starmer? Are they conservative, like Boris 2019 voters that will remain that were still in the Tory party, or are they kind of Leave voters that voted Tory, like the red wall voters that are coming back? What do you think on that?
So, I mean, it's a lot more messy than that. But one theme we are picking up on generally is that the Remain Leave divide does seem to be starting to weaken. So when the Conservative Party are up in the polls, they are generally up slightly more among Remain voters than they are among Leave voters. So generally, when you look at the polls, generally the Tories are up a little bit amongst Remain voters and down a little bit amongst Leave voters. Labour are up among both both groups, but up a little bit more amongst Leave voters than they are up amongst Remain voters. I mean, it's not much. The Tories still hold a massive lead among Leave voters. But maybe we're starting to see signs of that divide weakening. So what I would generally expect to happen at the next election, let's assume that there's a moderate swing towards the Labour Party, 4 points, let's say, 3 points. What the numbers were indicating is that the direction we're starting to head in is maybe a little bit of a larger swing among Leave voters than Remain voters, which means that we might see a little bit more of a movement back in those sort of red wall constituencies than we see in the rest of the country, and maybe starting to see a bit of a reversal of the trends of the last sort of 10 years of Labour really struggling in working class areas. But, it's too early to tell. And obviously the Conservatives are going to try absolutely hard to really push that, keep that divide in place, given it helps them electorally because of the way, where these voters are located, and it helps them hold on to that winning coalition that they had in 2019.
Yeah, that's definitely something to look out for, kind of going in the future. And that's definitely something. Whenever I see a poll, I'm definitely the first thing I'm going to is I'm looking at Leave Remain, and obviously education. Whenever that's polled, that's a very key divide that we're seeing, especially in Canada and the U.S. And when we see it in the U.K., we obviously it's really important to remember that when you look at an education tab, it's basically also kind of colored by Leave Remain as well, based on the vote for the referendum.
And age as well. I mean, all of these things correlate, and obviously, the education and Brexit vote are really important. But age is the biggest dividing line in British politics at the moment. It correlates with both of those things. But young people are still overwhelmingly backing the Labour Party, and old people are overwhelmingly backing the Conservative Party, and that's something that has become so extreme in polling in recent years.
Mm-hmm.
Have we seen any numbers regarding the age difference for support for Starmer? When we, our mentions are full of people with the Corbyn versus Starmer, and it was interesting to hear you say that 40% or whatever the number was about people not supporting Starmer come from Labour.
So they're similar to that. Starmer's the drop in Starmer's approval rating has come from Labour voters predominantly, and Labour voters are also more likely to be young. Therefore, Starmer's numbers have also dropped a lot more. Starmer's approval rating has dropped a lot more amongst younger voters than it has among older voters. Again, we've got to be careful here because we're talking about the fall and the levels. So it's fallen more amongst young voters, but it's still higher amongst younger voters than it is amongst older voters. But yes, I mean, it is that there's that group that seemed to be overwhelmingly positive to him last summer that are calling to him now.
I think I'll get Kyle in on this. Kyle, if you're Keir Starmer right now, are you panicking? Are you kind of scared that maybe people are just going to view Johnson popularly now and then that'll never change? Or what are you trying to focus on politically, right? Like, are you trying to criticize the government? Are you trying to focus on other things? What would you be doing if you were Keir Starmer right now?
Well, I wouldn't be panicking for sure. I think obviously there's still a few years left before the UK goes back to another election, and as Chris, definitely pointed out, there's a lot of reasons why this is happening, and all of them are fairly transient. So the vaccine, the fallout, both positive and negative from Brexit, and basically we're in the midterm doldrums for a government right now. It's not surprising that the leader of the opposition is having a little bit of a slump after just getting elected, getting that bounce from being in the news. It's none of this is unsurprising. What he needs to do is just continue to make sure that they start to nail down what Starmer and his version of Labour is actually going to stand for, and avoid what kind of hobbled Jeremy Corbyn between 2017 and 2019 especially, and which was the perception that either he didn't know what he was doing, that there was people in the background that were fighting against him, that the party was just not a contender for government, that was just not going to be there to govern for the country in any manner that would be beneficial. And that led people to vote for the Conservatives, for Theresa May again, and then for Boris Johnson. So he's got a tough job ahead of him. It's not going to be easy. This is not a cakewalk that, some commentators thought, because Boris was lagging so far behind in so many of the polls early on, especially at the start of the pandemic. It's not going to be at all simple for him to get there, but I wouldn't worry. I would just continue building up the party, hopefully do well in these locals and regionals, and just, build out. And eventually, by the time the actual election campaign comes, when people are once again paying attention to who their leaders are going to be, Starmer will have a record that he can point to and an idea he can point to about, hey, this is what my government will do better, hopefully, than what Boris and the Conservatives are doing. And, especially after, if it goes in 2024, that'll be 14 years of Conservative government under 3 different leaders. People might just be looking for a change. It just could be a basic gravity rolling that rock down the hill that's going to take up Boris rather than anything Starmer does. He just needs to be in a position to be able to present himself well to the electorate. That's all.
Yeah, I pretty much agree with everything Carl just said there. And there's also this point that governments lose elections. It's not necessarily oppositions that win them. All Keir Starmer can really do. I mean, it's a slightly oversimplified point, but the main thing Keir Starmer has to do is to just make sure the Labour Party is there to catch the ball if the government does drop it. And I don't think there's anything he's done so far that is particularly going to make that an impossible job if there is something that comes along to harm the Conservatives over the next few years.
Yeah. So I think do we have any other questions? Yeah, Nikos?
Not a question, but I think even with all the consternation with the latest numbers, I think things could get worse for Labour. I think we don't know what the post-pandemic economy is going to look like. I think most people think that there's going to be a boom and not so much a depression, that the jobs are going to come back, people are going to be spending money in the economy. And, it could have been that the Conservatives wouldn't have a major issue after Brexit to keep them in power. But I think with what could be a really good economy going into the next election. I don't think Labour has an issue that's really going to stand out that will allow them to take many votes.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting, and it's really going to depend on what he is campaigning on, right? I think we're pretty much all in agreement that Keir Starmer is not the problem, right? I mean, again, governments are judged on their record, not whatever some guy in Parliament who talks every day is to saying, right? Like, there will be a time. I mean, again, we know this will happen in the future. There will be a debate between Boris Johnson and Keir Starmer. Probably Boris. I say probably more probably Boris Johnson, because he could get like shivved, as Tory leaders tend to do. But there's gonna be a debate between Keir Starmer and probably Boris Johnson, and in that debate, what Keir Starmer says, that's how he's going to be judged. That's how the election is going to go, not based on what Boris Johnson's approval ratings are in the middle of him basically finishing off a once in a generation, or maybe once in 100 years pandemic, right? So I think moving on.
Just one thing before we move on, I was going to say is one of the most beneficial things for Starmer and Labour right now is that there's simply a lack of any other options. This is not 2010 where you had, Nick Clegg hanging around the shiny new kid on the block, and Liberal Democrats in a position where they could actually fight an election well. It is either Conservatives or Labour throughout most of England at this point. And that's obviously where you win these elections. So, all they got to do is write it out, and they should be fine.
On the other hand, you don't have the Brexit Party or Reform probably being as much of an issue this time around.
Yeah, no Nigel Farage to glance off some of those votes for you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that'll be interesting in terms of what the Reform Party is even going to be campaigning on, right? We don't even know what issues, like, they say reform, but like what reform? Like, I mean, the whole thing was they wanted to leave the EU, right? Cool, they did it. Mission accomplished, right? What's next? What else do you want to reform, right? And if people are like, yeah, it doesn't really seem like a really meaningful amount of reform that they're suggesting, or a needed reform, then I think people are going to kind of ignore them and look just to go back to either voting Tory or Labour. So I think the next kind of most interesting place in terms of polling right now is Scotland. Middle of the pandemic, again, kind of like we're seeing nationally, there was a huge dip in support for remaining in the Union. We saw Scottish Nationalism, sometimes a 10-point lead in some polls, and the SNP polling were holding a commanding lead, basically marching towards a majority in the Holyrood elections. Now we're seeing a lot different of a story on that, and even now when we're looking at some of the by-elections we're having, again, small sample sizes, very small amount of people voting in some of these by-elections in the middle of a pandemic for a local ward office, we're starting to see Conservative gains in some of these seats, which would generally not be a great sign for Scottish independence and for the SNP as a whole. Chris, I'll go to you. Why do you think we're seeing this kind of recession? Was it receding in kind of support for nationalism? Is it that people looked at the polls like, oh my God, this could really happen, and we need to kind of, maybe this isn't what we want? What do you think is causing this?
I don't think that we can necessarily draw a sort of firm conclusion yet that we are seeing a recede in nationalism. What we do know is that there was the average going into the pandemic was a lead of maybe about 2, 3, 4 points for yes in Scotland. So Scotland's become an independent country, and we're probably now back at that stage again. In the middle, what we saw when we had a historically popular Holyrood government and a relatively unpopular Westminster government for quite a period of time, because the Scottish government was seen as doing incredibly well at responding to the pandemic, and the UK government was seen, particularly in Scotland, as doing incredibly badly at responding to the pandemic. That then sort of shot them up another bit into numbers that were fairly unreasonable. So now the Scottish government's become a bit less popular. There's more divisions in the SNP and arguments, and they've generally lost that rally round the flag effect that you get in a crisis. And the UK government has recovered a little bit. Therefore, you've sort of moved back to these, more normal numbers that we're seeing, which is a small lead for yes. And similarly with the SNP's polling numbers going into they're going into these May elections. It's always really been touch and go whether they'd get a majority. I still think they'll probably just about get it on their own. But it's now touch and go. And again, it was going into this pandemic, but with this period in the middle of like incredibly high numbers, based off the fact that Nicola Sturgeon was really the most popular politician in the country, at least among her own voters.
Yeah, and that's kind of the point when we talk about Scottish polling is generally, and I mean looking at the 2019 election, 2019 EU elections, European Union elections, even going back to kind of 2017, you generally through the election, like right before the election period, you see massive SNP leads. They're like, oh, cool, they're at 55% of the vote, right? They're really gonna do it. And then we get to the election period, and then they just start slowly coming down, just every time, just little by little, and then eventually, they're like substantially lower. They're like generally 10 or so. They're generally around 45% or so. Now again, actually in 2019 that actually kind of turned around because they actually ended up kind of coming out on the high end of that. They actually outperformed their polls a little in there. But kind of traditionally you'll see this massive support for the SNP outside of election period. The second people are like getting ready to start voting, they're like, yeah, okay, maybe I'm not going to vote for the SNP though. And again, I think based on how Holyrood works, for example, they have kind of single member districts and then they have kind of the list vote. I do kind of think it's going to be very close. I think they may have just a majority or like very close to it. Again, before it was looking like they're going to have a commanding majority, but now it's going to be kind of just close. Kyle, what are your thoughts on where the SNP are standing right now? Or do you think they're in risk of not getting a majority, or what do you think?
Well, let's remember that even if they don't get a majority, they still have the votes, particularly related to independence matters of the Scottish Greens, who are probably going to get anywhere between 5 to 10 seats. Their polling is a little bit down, but it's not down enough to keep them out of Parliament. But that being said, I do think there is probably a bit of a concern, and there are some scandals swirling around the SNP. They've been in power for a very long time, so that's not necessarily unsurprising, but that could ding them in a few places. The thing, again, going for the SNP is that they kind of lack an effective opposition. The Conservatives have their new leader in Scotland, whose name I forgot, but I know his face because he does very unhappy pictures everywhere.
Douglas Ross.
Douglas Ross, thank you. And then you have the semi-new, Scottish Labour leader. Both of them have not really established themselves. Both of them not really necessarily, they don't seem poised for a breakout. So at the end of the day, like whether or not they're on 63 seats or they're on 65 or 70 even, it's not going to matter for the SNP. They have a working government more or less at this point, and it doesn't seem like anything is going to take them down, regardless of the potential games in some of these local seats in the Scottish by-elections. So, and if I was Nicola Sturgeon, I would not be that concerned.
I suppose like, okay, Nicola Sturgeon is going to be First Minister of Scotland after the May elections. I mean, I don't think anybody is really questioning that. She'll either get a majority on her own or she'll have enough seats with the Greens in order to command a majority. Or even if she doesn't, to be honest with you, Labour would probably rather go into coalition with her than vote down an SNP government and, or vote with the Tories to bring down SNP government, I would have thought. I think the questions are twofold. One, does she get a majority on her own? If she does, that probably makes her argument for another referendum on Scottish independence slightly easier. Yes, there's an argument for it, even if she got a majority with the Greens. But I think if the SNP got a majority on her own, that symbolic victory helps her politically in making that argument to Johnson that she should have another referendum, and it would seem more unreasonable among the Scottish population for Boris Johnson to reject that referendum. And if it's seen as more unacceptable for Johnson to reject it, he's less likely to, because that could risk increasing the support for nationalism further. The second thing to watch out for that's particularly interesting is ultimately the race for second place. The Tories ended up coming in second place in the last Scottish Parliament election, and that's shook up politics ever since. it now looks like the Labour Party do actually stand a chance of clambering back into second place in Scotland and sort of cementing themselves back as the opposition party. Firstly, because the electoral system does slightly benefit them over the Tories because their support is slightly more centred in urban areas. But also because, less people hate them. And now the SNP are potentially dropping in support. Some of those SNP voters might go over to the Labour Party, and that might be enough, particularly with a new shiny leader who's come in at about the right time and might get exposure and, land well with the public at, coming in as a new leader at the start of an election campaign actually isn't always a bad idea. We saw how it worked for Jacinda, for example. So all of these things could come together to push Labour potentially into second place, and that could then be quite significant for national politics because, it could help a Labour starting to win back Scotland narrative. It could help Labour, help Labour in Scotland going into the next general election if they're getting more airtime or more coverage up there and things like that. So they're the two things that I think are really significant to watch out for in the Scotland election.
Yeah, that's we'll obviously know more about that because again, I had kind of hesitated on building a model for kind of all the locals because there was a period of time, kind of a couple of months ago that we were unsure if they were going to get postponed again. But now that's definitely that risk factor is definitely gone. So we're definitely going to build a Scotland Holyrood model. We're going to build a Welsh Assembly model, London mayoral. Probably do kind of all the other mayoral elections. We're going to build that into a model, and we'll be releasing that probably couple weeks or so from now. So then that kind of segues us into our last thing, which is kind of the English local elections, which are kind of the other more interesting point. Now, again, actually today we definitely did not plan this, but earlier today it was actually announced that we were going to get a by-election in Hartlepool as the current Labour MP for Hartlepool stepped down. That's actually kind of really big news. This is going to be like the single biggest by-election, like probably the single most important election we've had in the UK since 2019 itself. It's actually a very crucial election. We don't know when would it be on the day of the locals or how would they do that?
Yeah, it looks that way. So the rumours at the moment, I don't think we've had anything official, is that so the party that holds the seat gets to decide on the election day here in the UK for bizarre reasons, and it looks like Labour's going to move the writ so that it happens on May the 6th.
Okay, so that'll just another kind of cherry on top of that election day. Our most recent model run actually has the Conservatives picking up that seat over Labour. Now, just to kind of put a kind of asterisk on that, in 2019, our model also had the Conservatives winning that seat over Labour. The reason for that, and then the reason it was wrong, is because we underestimated Richard Tice by a substantial amount. For the Brexit Party vote share in Hartlepool in 2019, he got a little bit higher. He definitely ate into some Conservative support there, and then as such, Labour was able to take it very narrowly. It was a pretty narrow victory, but they were able to win that out in the end. So I'll go to you, Chris. What's your expectation for this from what you're seeing in the polling? Do you think our model is right in saying that's a Conservative seat based on Johnson's current pretty high approval ratings and substantial polling lead, or do you think because again, right now we don't know what Richard Tice is going to do. As far as I know, there's been no formal announcement from him and the Reform Party as to whether or not they're going to stand in the election or if he'll run. What do you think is going to happen there?
I mean, it's very difficult to know because we don't really have a good understanding of who those Brexit Party voters are in Hartlepool. How many of them came from the Conservative Party and how many of them came from the Labour Party? Because, as you said, one of the reasons why your model probably got Hartlepool right last time is because the Brexit Party vote there was weird because the leader was standing there. But in what way was it weird? They did better than everyone expected. They did better than they should have done there, given the national numbers. But how did they do better? Where did those voters come from that allowed them to do better? Now, that's an important question because if that vote disappears now, that vote is going to go back somewhere or going to go to not voting. And if we don't know where it came from in the first place, we can't really build up a good picture of where it's going to go. So we're sort of, we're blind going into this. I think what we can say fairly certainly is this is possibly one of the worst places imaginable for Labour to have a by-election. They've potentially got everything to lose and very little to gain. The expectation should be at this stage of the Parliament that you hold all of your seats and you're trying to gain seats off the Tories. So this is given that the by-election is basically in the seat that Labour is probably in the country most likely to lose out of all of the seats they currently hold, is the first place to be a by-election is potentially disastrous for them. And obviously by-elections are just weird things happen because it doesn't necessarily follow the national picture. Lots of resources get pumped in from all of the parties. There's weird third party candidates who get a lot of airtime, so it doesn't necessarily always follow the national trajectory. So there's lots of stuff here that could happen that's weird. The bookies currently put the Tories down as the favourites to win. I think actually that Labour's probably odds on to hold it. Usually you'd expect oppositions to slightly outperform in by-elections, and I'd have thought that would be enough to snatch it. I think that Brexit Party vote will not go back to the Tories if it disappears as much as people think it will. So I think Labour will probably just about hold on, but God knows at this stage.
Yeah, I love UK bookies. I haven't even seen the line yet. I didn't even know they had one. But it's like hours later they already have a line. That's great. What is the line actually?
What we got? So this is Ladbrokes was the first out. Tories are 8 to 11. Labour's 11 to 10. That's come in a little bit from earlier as well. So those two are the closing. I can't speak bookie talk, but was it? The Tories are drifting and Labour's doing the opposite of drifting. But yeah,
that's not bad. I think at that price you'd bet the Tories, but if you got Labour closer to 2 to 1, I'd take Labour at 2 to 1. I think that's probably a better deal because again, we don't know. And again, that will depend a lot on if Richard Tice runs or not, right? I mean, and to be honest, though, and I said this on Twitter earlier today, this is actually kind of make or break for the Reform Party, because if you were to pick a seat that would be best for the Reform Party to run in a by-election, it'd be this one. This one or one of the Bradford ones that are kind of roughly like a little bit down the road there, but it'd be like basically this one. This would be their best shot. And Richard Tice is actually currently their party leader. So if they're going to be expected to run here, and if they don't do well here, then it really kind of undermines the entire purpose of the Reform Party if they can't do well in this by-election. So that, I think even more so for Labour, obviously they don't want this by-election. This is a seat that they do not want to have a by-election in. This is actually a really big test for Reform, and if they don't do well here, it really it undermines their entire electoral argument for why they need to exist, right? So that's another key thing that we need to look at when we look at these results. Kyle, what do you think about this? Do you think Labour is maybe not, it's being underlooked right now, but if we see kind of a substantial Reform Party vote, maybe they could be a pretty decent bet? What do you think?
So I think Chris really nailed on the head when he said this is kind of the worst constituency for Labour to possibly have a by-election be held in. Hartlepool is literally the worst. If they could pick any other seat that they hold, I think they'd rather do it. But I kind of agree with Chris. I think they're probably generally more favored to hold on to the seat. I don't see why Reform and Richard Tice would not run in this seat, considering he came within basically 10 points of winning it last time. Why would you not run now that you're the leader of this particular party? And if that does happen, it's very likely that the right-wing vote will split along Labour to coast by on about 30 to 35% of the vote. Not surprising at all if that would happen. But it'll be interesting to see because, by this time, maybe people will say, in Hartlepool, will say, actually, I like Boris Johnson a lot. I'm going to vote him. I'm not going to vote for this random third-party candidate. I want to see a Conservative MP hold this constituency for probably the first time in many, many a moon. It's hard to say, but I think Labour's probably going to hold it. I feel bad for them. It reminds me a lot of. It reminds me kind of not quite the same situation, but when and sorry, Chris, for doing this, but relating back to Canadian politics, since most of our listeners are Canadian, reminds me of the by-elections for the Conservatives and Brandon, Surrey, and Whitby, which they both held on to. to be sure, but the Liberals nearly turfed them in both of those seats. Now, it was great that they held on to them as a government, and they, it was really, really went well for them. But it was a real big sign that even if they held on to that a storm was coming for them, and it was not going to be well. And lo and behold, 2 years later, we saw them completely swept out of power. Obviously, Labor's not in power, but if they lose Hartlepool or if they just win it just barely, that's proof that their problems are not over. They have more to lose than they currently already have lost between 2017 and 2019. So the thing is, I'm really excited to have this by-election happen. It's going to be talk of a town for quite a while.
Just as evidence as well of how weird things can go, Hartlepool is, as far as I'm aware, the only place in the country, or maybe even in the world, that's basically elected a monkey to be their mayor. Back in 10 years ago now, they had a mayoral election in Hartlepool, and they elected the mascot of the local football team. And I think he was actually a really good mayor in the end, but he ran the local council for nearly a decade, I think, off the back of that, just because they're mostly in protest at the idea of having this directly elected mayor in the first place. But it just goes to show how these contests, particularly when you've got some weird local niche by-election thing, no real reason to vote for anybody, can just be weird. And I don't know what's going to happen with the Reform Party. Obviously, they're slightly different to Angus the Monkey, but what argument are they going to use for people to vote for them at the moment? That's what I can't really get my head around. You sort of alluded to it with, reform what? They've sort of a little bit anti-lockdown, but nobody in the country is anti-lockdown. They sort of want less government spending, but that's not particularly popular. They just don't really have a coherent message that appeals to a selection of voters in the same way as they did over Brexit and immigration. So I just can't really see what their appeal is that's going to win them enough supporters to be noticeable.
Yeah, and you said that right. And the lockdowns. Well, by May the lockdowns will be over, right? Mission accomplished, right? We did it, right? Nikos, do you have anything you like to add on this? Do you have any? What do you think? Do you think that maybe the kind of third party can make some damage here, can do some damage here or not?
No, I don't think so. I think switching to a less well-known leader will hurt them. I think Labour can actually benefit. The by-elections tend to have lower turnout. I think there's going to be some apathy from people. They're happy with the government right now. So Labour, I think they can probably get their vote out a bit better than the Conservatives right now, because Labour people are more upset, I would think, than the Conservatives, and so they would have a reason to go to the ballot box than people that are generally happy with how things are going right now.
I bet Nigel Farage is kicking himself for excluding himself out of politics just before Mike Hill decided to step down from Hartlepool, because that would have been a good constituency for him to run in, right?
Yeah, that would have been kind of interesting, actually. I mean, who knows? Farage has said many things and then gone around and done many other different things. So who knows, right? Maybe he'll. But I suspect if Richard Tice wanted the seat, this would be the seat that this would be basically Richard Tice's seat to run in, and I'd assume Farage would probably let him do that as well. So then now let's move on to the other elections happening on that day as well. Now again, because in 2020 there was supposed to be a whole set of UK local elections that got postponed a year. This is kind of, I think we're going to call it Super Thursday. Because there's just so many elections on so many different levels. You've obviously got a lot of councils up. You've got the Welsh Assembly. You've got the Scottish Assembly. You've got London. You've got kind of the London Upper Council. Obviously, London Mayoral. We're probably not going to talk about that one too much. That seems kind of a done deal, and I don't really see much weakness there for Sadiq Khan. Should be able to put that one away pretty easily. Kind of the only question is he going to get over 50% on the first ballot, or will it go to a second ballot? That's kind of really the only question on that one. But there's a lot more other interesting mayoral ones. When you look at the West Midlands mayoral, that one's going to be very interesting. That one's currently held by the Conservatives. They actually won it back in 2017, 17, right? Yeah, 2017. Yes. Um, Interesting question as to whether or not they'll be able to hold it or not. West Midlands were interesting. The area encompassing it, Conservatives were able to make some gains in there in 2019. Most notably, West Bromwich West and West Bromwich East, seats they had never ever won before in the history of the UK. So that one can be kind of interesting. And then you also got some other ones. You've got like the Tees Valley. That one's kind of a northerny kind of Brexity seat. Conservatives made some gains there in 2019 as well. You've got a lot of these, like some of the safer ones like Manchester and Liverpool. That's fine. You can kind of cross those out. And you've got obviously the west of England. That's kind of a Bristol area seat. That one is probably going to go Labour. That's actually being elected for the first time. But I'll go to Chris. Which ones are you kind of looking at? And like, what do you think about the West Midlands one? Kind of the one that everybody's gonna be talking about. Who do you think can win that one?
Yeah, so I think the thing about West Midlands and Tees Valley, which is actually really important but doesn't get talked about very much, is incumbency. One of the reasons Sadiq's going to do very well is because everyone knows who he is and he hasn't done anything to mess up. And when you are a mayor, it's actually very hard to do anything to mess up. And you kind of got the same pattern in the West Midlands and Tees Valleys. Back in 2017, they elected Conservatives who are fairly well known in their local area. If they're known for anything, it's a positive thing, and that gives them a little bit of a bounce. So you would therefore expect them to do a few points, at least a few points. We don't really know because we haven't had very many of these comparable elections in the UK, but I would expect them to do a few points better than what you'd see on the national picture. And I think given the kind of numbers we're looking at nationally, particularly given a slight rebound in the Conservatives' numbers now, that's probably going to be enough for them to hold on to West Midlands and Tees Valley. So that's what I'd expect going in. And then, yes, but you don't have the same thing in the West of England mayoral election. There's no incumbent Conservative coming in. And of course, that's the kind of flip. Yes, if the West Midlands and Tees Valley are two red woolly areas that are moving away from the Labour Party, the West of England is the complete opposite of that. It's a southern, Remainy, fairly urban or suburban area, at least, that has been moving towards the Labour Party in recent years. And therefore, it might be one that, although, you know, it'd be weird, I think, 10 years ago to discuss somewhere like that voting for the Labour Party, I think it shouldn't be a particularly big challenge for them now. So that would be my expectation going in. Labour holding all of the obvious ones, London, Liverpool, Manchester. The Tories probably holding on to West Midlands and Tees Valley, mostly off the back of incumbency, and then Labour having a good shot and probably winning that West of England mayoral election.
Yeah, I think that one will be that one's going to be really interesting in the sense that it never happened before, right? And to be honest, when you look at our most recent projection, we actually have Labour picking up one of the seats there in that West of England area, the kind of suburban Bristol area. We have them picking up Filton and Bradley Stoke, right? They actually did win. Labour, it was kind of one of the last local by-elections we had before the pandemic hit. They actually were able to pick up a local council seat in that area, and that was some people are surprised by that, but again, when you look at these areas, a lot of them are actually pretty Remainy, and they've been moving towards Labour, and when you put it in that perspective, it's not the most surprising that Labour is expected to do pretty well there. Kyle, what are you looking for in the mayoral elections? Which ones are you focusing on the most, and do you think there could be any upsets in some of the other ones that we're talking about or not?
I don't know about upsets. I know you had your eyes on Doncaster, I believe.
Yes, that's one of the kind of the lower. So that's not. Yeah, so it is a mayoral election. Again, the UK has a lot of different layers to that.
Authority,
yeah, single authority mayors. Yeah, Doncaster is one I definitely look at as like danger for Labour. This is one of the most leave areas of the entire country, and somehow they have a mayoralship here. And like, yeah, so we'll see how that goes for them. But yeah, and whenever we talk about Doncaster, just one more quick thing. Whenever we talk about Doncaster, we talk about, because this is when Ed Miliband comes up, because that's one of his his district is right there in Doncaster. It's also one of the most Levy seats in the entire country. So when you start looking at stuff like Doncaster shifting to the Tories, Ed Miliband starts getting a little nervous there, and he actually had a substantially closer race than most people thought. Our model was a lot closer to where that was, but he actually was in a lot less comfortable of a position than people thought it was. Anyway, go ahead with which seats you're looking at, Kyle.
Well, I mean, you guys already talked about it briefly, which is the West of England one, which is, again, Bristol, Somerset, and areas like that. I'm not sure if it includes Bath or not. If it does, that's even more funny because, as you mentioned, it's going to be pretty amusing if Labour loses places like Doncaster and they lose Tees Valley and the West Midlands again, but they gain something like the west of England, which is an area that's somewhat traditionally, going back in elections, an area where the Conservatives and Liberal Democrats did well. This is Somerset. This is where, a bunch of people that are not necessarily always going to be voting for Labour because it's not a traditionally heavy industry base in the area, are going to vote for, Team Orange or Amber, or whatever they call themselves. So it's more sign of how the sort of Remain-Leave split has made Labour see some more opportunities expanding in the South while they're losing their traditional votes in the North. And as was mentioned earlier on, we'll see if that actually holds beyond Brexit. But, it could be like a new Canterbury situation, right? They already have all 4 seats that touch Bristol proper. I don't know if Filton does, but at least it's a directly close suburb seat. And it's one that's flipping in our model. So I find that mostly amusing. And it makes me wonder where Labour thinks they can try to hit up next. Are they going to try to go for seats like Truro, and they're going to go for places and hitting out more in Brighton, or the seats surrounding Brighton and Arran and places like that? Because where else can they expand if they're going to start losing their Hartlepool?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I suppose Labour is going. If Labour starts, if Labour has a good election, whether that be this upcoming local elections or anything, the next general election, say they do well, where are they going to start gaining seats from? It's not going to be completely the same as the places they lost. It's going to be part of that. It's going to be some of those seats maybe in the red wall, so-called, that are easier to win. But it's not going to be completely the same. I don't think they're ever going to completely reverse the trend that we've seen over the past 20 years. So it is going to mean, maybe not winning back those seats that are now completely out of reach across the north of England. And it's going to be winning back some seats across the south that now suddenly look winnable, despite that seeming crazy a few years ago. Canterbury is obviously given as one. A lot of those other seats, and basically anywhere across the south coast of England that is at least slightly urban. Bournemouth potentially is a good example. And yes, those areas around Brighton, around Bristol, and commuter towns into London. So yeah, I mean, they are. I don't think it's an either-or thing. It's about sort of winning back the easiest set of both. Is probably what I'd expect Labour will land on, and that will definitely include the west of England.
Yeah, and that's kind of the point when talking about that, right? I mean, right now, again, we have the Conservatives at pretty much their strongest in our model, at least since the last election. And even though we have a bunch of those old red wall seats, like we have literally every seat that has Doncaster in the name of it going Conservative at this point in the north. Again, we've had a couple of really bad polls for Labour in the north. Again, that's just mostly off of Johnson's approval rating. But even then, we have Labour picking up seats like Milton Keynes North. We have them picking up. Yep, Hastings and Rye. Yep, Wycombe, right, and obviously the Bristol one, and the Truro and Falmouth, right. We have them winning those seats, even at this kind of polling gulf that they're in, right? Even then, they're like, yeah, we're winning these seats, right? And the thing is, once you start getting to actually, if they actually start, and then Reading West, right? Obviously, that one's just but people are just assuming Reading West is gone, right? That's crazy. If you'd said 5 years ago in 2015, yeah, Labour's just expected to win Reading West, people thought that was crazy, but here we are, right? And this is the thing.
And one big unknown in this as well, which we won't really have a good read on next election. And maybe it's nothing, maybe it's irrelevant in the end. But I think that there's a certain amount of urban flight that we're kind of expecting. This idea that lots and lots of people are going to move out of London and move into surrounding areas because, I can go down from being in the office 5 days a week to being in the office 2 days a week. Oh, I don't need to live so close to it. I can live in a commuter town and commute in. And so all of these people from Labour, predominantly Labour voters, moving from the city into the surrounding commuter areas, which has already happened, but might dramatically speed up over the next years, might really sort of speed up that process and might mean that some of those commuter towns turn red even quicker than we might have otherwise expected. It might end up being nothing. This might not end up being a thing that happens, right? We don't actually know what effect the pandemic is going to have. It's something really interesting to think about.
Especially
It's
if
like a
it's
version of
youth people, young people moving out of London to the surrounding communities for cheaper real estate.
Yeah.
Oh,
No,
we
exactly.
literally saw that happen in the States, and we see that happening in Canada, right? You know, people are leaving Toronto where the rental and housing prices are just sky high to go out to the suburbs, and they're turning more and more red every day.
Yeah, and it's always been happening, but I think there's a potential idea that it could really start to happen even quicker in the next few years, which might mean that we start to see really crazy swings in places like Reading or in places like the great town of Milton Keynes.
Yes, it's actually so funny because it was like that was one of the last actually redistribution of seats was literally Milton Keynes, because they were like, oh man, this area is growing so fast, we need to like split it up into 2 seats, and then like they just haven't done redistribution since then. It's hilarious. And they just were like, okay, we need to change this 1 seat. But yeah, so that's, and again, obviously we'll get a redistribution in a couple months. Actually, I think we'll start seeing the new redistribution, so that will obviously
Can't
affect
wait.
a lot of, I'm really excited for that. We're gonna see what that looks like soon, and that's obviously gonna color a lot of this analysis. And then kind of the last point we want to hit on, we've kind of alluded to it with labor gains in the South, and we hit on with Doncaster there are a lot of, because we talked about the red wall seats that have fallen. Now that we're looking at the first local elections since then, there are a lot of red wall council seats, and those are going to be interesting to watch. And some of those results might look pretty ugly for Labour on the May election, right? And that's going to be kind of, in my opinion, kind of the test of the hypothesis that you said in the polling, right? If you're seeing this kind of depolarization along Leave Remain, we should start seeing it in some of these councils. So Labour, there's some they're going to lose. Some are so far gone that they're going to lose some of those council seats. But then if they staunch the bleeding, right? Like some of these seats are like, I think Labour has pretty much every seat on some of them. If they start coming down a little bit, like we'll have to see if they are able to start holding these, or if the damage is as bad as it could be. I think that's kind of the real indicator that I'm looking at for some of these more local level results, instead of kind of the mayorals. When we start looking at down to the ward level, I kind of want to see exactly how badly Labour does in some of these seats. What do you think of that as well? What are you looking for in terms of that, Chris?
I mean, it's always worth adding the caveat that local elections are a different sort of ball games. General elections, turnout's different. You get sort of different incumbency effects. Some people, at least enough people, do appreciate that they're voting for something different. Maybe they'd prefer the Conservatives running their local services, but Labour running nationally, or vice versa. Labour running the country nationally, or more often, I think, in a lot of these red wall areas, vice versa. So yeah, I mean, we shouldn't necessarily read too much into that. But yes, I mean, basically the big thing I'm looking for is the extent to which the national, the trend we saw in 2019. Okay, I think we're all going to expect Labour to be a little bit up on that, but where is that increase on 2019 coming? And does it look like the trend is continuing, or, as the national polls tend to show, is that trend starting to very slowly, very slightly reverse? And I think that's the kind of picture that I'll be trying to draw out of this. And then the other thing that we haven't spoken about, of course, which is going to be fascinating and potentially really important, is what happens in Wales. Labour is touch and go about whether they're going to be able to pull off a majority in Wales. And if they don't, they're almost certainly going to end up in a government with nationalists in Wales. And then suddenly you start to ask the question, well, it was nationalists ending up in government in Scotland that ended up this sort of putting them on the trajectory that they ended up going on. Is this going to be, history doesn't always repeat itself, but is this going to be the thing that starts Wales on that same trajectory? So that's the other interesting thing I'll be looking out for as well.
Yeah, that Wales is also the other interesting one too. We'll obviously be modeling that, and we'll see how that model comes out for that. But that's another fascinating area. But again, we talk about the red wall. A lot of that rhymes in basically for Wales, right? We see a lot of those kind of red wall adjacent seats, literally adjacent to them in kind of the north of Wales, but also in that southern coal belt too. Those ones were so heavily Labour that even though we saw a huge dent in them in 2019. Some of them they didn't fall yet, but where are we going to see baseline 2019 to where they are now, right? What number? How is Labor going to do in those seats? Are they going to do better or worse? That's kind of the really big question, and we'll get more of that data in about a month, actually month and a half or so in May. But again, that's going to be a lot of really fun data points from that. I'm really looking forward to it. I'm sure you are as well, Chris. So
Oh, definitely.
yeah, so thank you for coming on today, Chris. You can where can we reach you on Twitter? Where can our followers add you on Twitter?
I'm at Chris Curtis 94.
Chris Curtis 94. Okay, so you go ahead and add Chris, and you can see his how when you talk on Twitter, you can see your analysis on Twitter and your comments. You can add Kyle on Twitter at Kyle J Hutton, and you can add Nikos at Twitter at Nikos Kiosius. And yeah, I think that's good. Thank you for coming on today, Chris, and have a good day. Thank you.
Thanks for having
Thanks,
me.
Chris.